I was given an elected. He became
Then everything
We haven't talked about the Germans got aeroplanes flying without propellers.
This is now
And we've got one.
I was sent to Farnborough in January 1943, not knowing the first thing about aeronautics or aeroplanes or anything, thinking that I was going to be a civil engineer. In fact, I was very, very fortunate because just before I arrived here in January, our first jet-propelled aeroplane, the Gloucester E-2839, was delivered to RAE Farnborough for us here at Farnborough to make measurements on the aeroplane with this new engine, a turbine engine rather than a propeller-driven. And to do that, a little special team had been set up which consisted of Smelt, a double first at Cambridge, Smith, a Cambridge engineer, Miss Fougere, a Cambridge mathematician, and a practical ex-apprentice of RAE called Dennis Higton.
Smelt said, "You'll never believe it, but we've got what they call a jet-propelled aeroplane. It's one of the secret things that we haven't talked about, but the Germans have got aeroplanes flying without propellers, and we've got one, and we've made it in England." So I thought, oh, the man's gone mad.
Historians of science have been more reluctant than, say, social and cultural historians to engage with oral history. And so they've missed the opportunity, really, to enrich the documentary sources and material sources that they've tended to rely on with the actual accounts of scientists themselves. And this has left history of science in often slightly depersonalised, especially for the 20th century, where we don't have the volume of letters and personal correspondence that we have for 19th century scientists like Darwin or Lord Kelvin, for example. Historians of science are sometimes uneasy with what they call the great men approach to history of science, which is something that an oral history project like ours could be accused of adopting, because we have interviewed primarily men and we have often chosen people who were very eminent within the scientific community. But for many of the projects, the people we've been able to interview were the junior people on those projects, because they were the younger people and they're still available for interview. So they're not the people who were most well associated with these projects, but they sometimes feel they're speaking for the whole team of people who were involved in that project. And so we have that kind of cross-section across the scientific community, including people who started off very junior, who ended up very eminent and very senior later on in their careers. Oral history allows us to actually get inside the lab almost in real time and get scientists to tell us about what they actually did when they were doing their work, how they interacted with their colleagues, how they maybe didn't get on with their colleagues, how personalities were involved in science, how teams worked, how those teams interacted with the people who managed them, with the funding structures. So it gives us a window onto the bigger issues in history of science, as well as giving us an insight into how individuals reacted within those structures. The oral history material that we've collected through the project really enriches our picture of post-war British science. It puts people back in, particularly into big government-funded or industry-funded research projects, which tend to be quite anonymous. So people know about the Harrier jump jet, but they don't know about the people who designed and built it. I think that's our main contribution, is to kind of put those people back in. But also, through those people, we've shed a lot of light on big issues that historians of science might already have written about, but haven't had those personal insights into the detail of the processes that were involved.
We waited until the blast wave had gone through before we opened the door and went out. And we saw this enormous cloud developing. I must say, compared with previous ones I'd seen, that was quite impressive.
Nature does exist, and there's some very mysterious things about it. I mean, the most mysterious thing, if we're going to get very deep into this, is that it's intelligible at all. I mean, why shouldn't it be just total chaos?
When we started actually making things, we had a shed. We built a shed at the bottom of the garden to do this.
And that's when I realised that that the right way to do all this was to think in terms of rigid plates. Then everything made sense, right? The whole thing was as obvious to me then as it is now to everybody who learns about it.
When scientists are usually interviewed, the focus is often on their career and on their scientific work only. So that's what they're used to talking about, and to some extent that's what they expected they'd be talking about when they said yes to us. But the life story or history approach asks them to talk about their whole life, in other words, things done outside of work and things done well before they became a career scientist. And this allows us to see that scientists are more ordinary than we thought they were, which doesn't sound very promising, but what I mean is that it allows us to see that science is a kind of work like any other, and it fits into a life which is like any other, and it has a day-to-day structure, and it has elements of the humdrum and the ordinary and the just doing. And so through the life story approach, scientists seem more familiar, I think, to us than they would otherwise be, and in that way more interesting. I've become very interested over the project in the way in which scientists talk about their childhood. They talk about their childhood at the start of the interview, but often throughout as well, nipping back to it to explain things. And it seems to me that childhood is often used as a way of making themselves understandable to others and perhaps making themselves seem and feel coherent, if you like. So when they look back at their childhood and they remember it, and they're often helped in remembering it by things like conversations with their parents, photograph albums, diaries and so on, when they look back at their childhood, they tend to pick out particular events that they see as significant or see as being formative, missing out all of the other details and complicated mixtures of things that happened in childhood and just picking out these few things.
My brother was given a chemistry set and I was given an electrical set. He became a chemist and I became a physicist.
And like all kids, I was interested in fireworks and bangs and crashes. And there was no health and safety whatever in those days. And if you blew your hand off in the course of it, well, that was very unfortunate. And you should have been more careful and all the rest. But there was no inquest.
This project has made a really important contribution to understanding the role of women in British science in the years since the Second World War, partly through interviews with women themselves, but also through asking male scientists about the women they worked with and the gender division of labour in their workplace environments. And often what men tell us about the women they worked with is actually much more interesting to someone whose research interests are in gender and science than actually the interviews with the women, who give us a very different perspective from that of the men that they worked with.
Well, I thought it was daft that somebody should be expected to work on samples that hadn't been collected by that person, because I had done geology because it was a field subject and that you needed to sort of get your hands dirty collecting the samples and relating to the environment from which they'd been collected. And I was also cross because it was the gender issue that was sort of dawning on me, really, and I thought that was stupid too, so I wanted to go for the reason of seeing it for myself, that particular location, but also going because they shouldn't stop me because I'm a woman.
I think one of the real challenges has always been sort of firstly giving people an idea that what they think of as being boring and everyday and just that job I did for 50 years actually was probably quite important in the big scheme of things, is something that other people are actually interested in, has had lots of consequences that people might actually be interested in.
There would be scope for another one or perhaps two big computers in the UK and 3 or 4 in Europe, probably half a dozen in the US, because they always have big ideas in the US. That was the eventual scope of our invention, we thought.
And I think that's a theme which, to me, goes through engineering, whether any branch of engineering. This creativity, this delivery, this element that says a bit of my DNA is in that. I have an element of me that's manifested in that building, that aircraft, that missile, that spacecraft. your success is also driven by the success of others around you. It's not, yes, there's an individual feeling of success, but you succeeded because you did your part, everybody else did your part, and you worked together as a team.
We were flying over Istanbul, and I could see the bridge that I'd designed glintering in the sun, and I had no doubt that I'd picked a profession that was worth doing, leaving something that you can see and admire from 35,000 feet can't be all that bad.